Alright, so let us talk about variables. We say that a variable is like a container and behaves like the value it was assigned, right? So essentially what we're saying is, let us go through these examples to understand what this definition is saying. When we say x is equals to 5 or y is equals to 2, the x in this case represents a variable. 5 represents a value, right? We say that we are assigning the value 5 to x, and the same thing, we're assigning the value 2 to y, right? So these two, x and y, are now variables, right? They are containers and they behave like their value, the values that they were assigned to, right? So for example, if we set x plus y, right, and store it in a variable z, right, we know that the resulting of x plus y, which would be stored in z, would be 7, right? Even though we did not have to say z is equal to 5 plus 2, we know that x is now behaves like what, like 5, and y now behaves like 2. That is why the resulting value is 7. So that's essentially how variables work, right? And then let us talk about the different types of variables that we encounter in C++, right? So the first is int, right, which is just short for integers, right? So int or integer variables, they store whole numbers from negative infinity to positive infinity, right? And then this can be your -1, it can be your 0, your 1, 2, whatever it is, right? Just make sure it's whole numbers from negative infinity to positive infinity, right? And then we have your doubles or your floats, right? They store decimal numbers, right? And then the difference between a double and a float, right? On a deeper level, we know that floats store less precision, right? They store less precision of a number, right? Meaning if we're given a number like this, right, where a float is essentially going to store, I think it is 7 or 8 bits of that number, right? So it shortens the number, right? And then with a double, it will store essentially more of that number, right? So that is the difference between a float and a double, right? And then we talk about a char, right? We say a char stores a single character, such as a, right? It stores only a single character, right? And then we'll talk about booleans, right? A boolean, this can be a bit complex, but essentially a boolean evaluates a specific expression, and then if that expression is true, it stores true in that variable, and if that expression is false, it stores false in that variable. We'll see some of the examples of how booleans work as we write the program, right? And then we have strings, right? Strings essentially store multiple characters, right? Example, the whole a whole sentence, right? Such as maybe hello world, right? So without further ado, let us get straight into writing a program so that we can see how these variables work. Alright, so let us create our first C++ variable, right? So to go about creating a variable, there's a few steps that we need to follow, right? Firstly is the data type, and then it is the name of the variable, and then we have to decide whether we are declaring it or we are assigning it, right? So we'll get to what those two mean, right? So suppose we wanted to create a variable x and assign it the value 20, right? So we need to tell the program what is the data type of x, right? So since we're going to assign the value 20 to x, we know that 20 is an integer, right? So we can go ahead and say int, right, the name of the variable, which is going to be x in this case, right? And then now this is where we talk about declaration versus assignment, right? Suppose we wanted to declare the variable x, right, and not give it a value immediately, right? And we will see how that makes sense when we go about input and output, right, in C++, right? But suppose we do not want to declare to give it a value immediately. What we could do is this step right here is essentially declaration, right? So we wouldn't have to do anything after this, right? So we have told the computer or the program that we have declared a variable x, and the data type of the variable is an integer, right? And then we can later on give x a value 20, right? And this is what we call assignment, right? So at this point, you don't need to say prefix x with int again, right? Because the computer, right, already knows that x is an integer, right? We can see an example. When you hover over x, you can see it says int x, right? So the computer, the program, already knows that the value of x the data type of x is an integer, right? So that is declaration, that is assignment, right? So at the same time, we can do these two steps in one go, right? So what we can do is say int x is equals to 20, right? Int x is equals to 20. So what we have done is we have declared it and we have assigned it all in one line, right? All right. So now that we know the difference between declaration and assignment, let us talk about the other data types that we have in C++, right? So suppose we wanted to store the value of a shirt, right? So we know that shirts or items in general are not whole numbers, right? The price of those items are not whole numbers, right? We would need a decimal data type to store that type of value, right? So we can use a double or a float. On a surface level, it does not really matter what you use unless you want to get deeper into how many decimals you want to actually store, right? So but then for now, a double would be fine, and then we'll name the variable price, give it the value 20.99, right? Semicolon, right? So a semicolon essentially is just like a full stop in normal English, right? It just brings an end to a statement, right? Or an expression, whatever it is. So it's very important that you use the semicolon, right? And the other data type would be chars, right? Char stores only a single character, right? So suppose that you got an A for a grade, as a grade rather, would want to store that in a char, right? So remember, it's very important that the prefix, or rather you tell the computer the data type first, the name of the variable, right? In this case, we'll name it grade symbol, right? And then the actual value, right? The actual value. As you can see, we have used single quotes to store the value, right? So in other programming language, you may see that you can switch between single and double, right? But in C++, it's very strict that you use a single, right, and not a double for chars, right? Because double codes are strictly for strings, right? Which we'll talk about later, right? And then the other variable that we need to talk about is a boolean, right? So suppose we want to ask a question if this person is a student or not, right? So we ask a question. The name of the variable is student or not, right? It's either a student or not. So the value of this can essentially be true if you are a student, or it can be false if you are not a student, right? So remember what we said about booleans, right? Booleans is either true or false, right? And it can also evaluate an expression, right? For example, if we had a value 9, right? 9 is 9 bigger than 5, right? We'll get into these comparisons as time goes, right? But the value of this would be true, right? So what it will do is it will evaluate this. So is 9 bigger than 5? If yes, 9 is bigger than 5, then the value of this is true, and then it's stored under this variable, which is okay. This wouldn't be an appropriate name for this, right? But yeah, I hope you understand what I'm saying, right? So yeah, let's just go back to the default. So is student, yes, I am a student, right? And then let us talk about strings, right? So string variable is actually a special kind of variable in C++, right? What we need to do whenever we want to work with string variables, remember what we said about string variables, right? They store multiple lines of text, right? Multiple lines of text. So whenever we want to work with strings, we need to include the library string, or to make things less complicated, we just need to include a file, right, string, that was already written by the developers of C++, right? And then that's when now we can use it in our file, right? So for us to use string, we need to prefix it with std, right, which is just a namespace we'll talk about when we get it, right? So this is essentially us telling the computer the data type, right? The data type of the variable that we are about to create, right? So I'll just store my name. So remember what we said about the single and double quotes, right? So we're saying that for strings, specifically, what we want to do is use double quotes, and then for chars, we want to use a single quote, right? So it is essentially the same thing that we're doing with the assignment and declaration of x, right? So this is the value, right? This is the name of the variable, and this is the data type, right? It's just that with strings are a bit more complicated, but just know that whenever you declare a string, you need to include the data, the file, right, or the library, whatever you prefer, and then you still need to prefix it with a std, because that's the name of the namespace, right? You can see that it says namespace std, which we'll talk about later, right? So right now, let us just console log all these variables to show that these display the way we want them to display, right? Right, now we can go ahead and compile the code, right? So once that compiles, we can run the program, right? And it displays exactly how we want it to display, right? So remember that the first thing that we printed out was the integer value, which was 20, and it was the name of, rather the price value, which was 20.99, the symbol A, right? And then what I forgot to mention rather is Boolean values store a true or false, right? And then we know that true is represented by 1 and false is represented by 0, right? And then we know that the string, we see that the string also represented, displayed what we wanted to display, which is to mail, right? So with that said, we have completed the introduction to variables, right? All right, so we've reached the end of this episode. If this episode was helpful, you can go ahead and leave a like, subscribe if you want to stay tuned, and leave a comment for any suggestions. Otherwise, cheers.